Good afternoon. My name is David Shulman, Senior Director of the new Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on the role of development finance and trusted connectivity in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We are fortunate to have Finland's Minister for Development, Cooperation and Trade, Ville Skinnari, with us here to address this topic, along with senior representatives from the International Finance Corporation and the U.S. National Security Council, all of whom our moderator, Dr. Karsh Arha, will introduce momentarily. I don't believe one could ask for a better lineup of key institutional perspectives on how the framework of trusted connectivity can be applied to improve coordination among democracies to ensure progress towards delivering on the global demand for physical and digital infrastructure. It can also lay the foundation for a digital future that advances human dignity, fundamental freedoms, and reaffirms the international rules-based order. Development finance institutions like the IFC, DFC, and FinFund are critical to mobilizing private capital to bridge the massive infrastructure financing gap facing developing countries, with the UN estimating that over $1 trillion in annual funding is required to achieve the SDGs, and with official development assistance last year amounting to only $1.6 billion. Today, digital connectivity and responsible data use are essential for development. Data is important for digital solutions that drive services and more efficient production in both the public and private sectors, as well as supporting evidence-based policymaking and holding governments to account. But data can also be used to limit freedoms through excessive government and corporate surveillance. Data can also be used by large corporations to dominate and distort the market. So the question is how to employ development finance to bridge these critical gaps and build the sort of infrastructure and connectivity that countries desperately require while upholding individual rights and mitigating against the possible negative outcomes of the transition to a digital economy. I think the conversation today will help us get closer to an answer, and it's my pleasure to now turn things over to the moderator of today's discussion, Atlantic Council Non-Resident Senior Fellow, Dr. Karsh Arha. Karsh?
Thank you very much, David. And again, it's a great honor to have this esteemed panel. Let me start with you, Minister. Mr. Skinner, you have an interesting portfolio, which is not that common, which is that you are the Minister for Finland, both for trade and for development. And as such, when the debate is there whether there should be trade or aid be the right way for developing in developing countries, you are the right man to talk about it because you have both portfolios. Now, as your experience, as not only you are in charge of furthering Finland's economic relations and competitive edge, but also meeting the global emerging nations' development needs. I want you to talk about from your perspective what that means, how do you go about it, and what the concept of trusted connectivity helps in your particular brand of doing the dual objectives. And I will take one bit to say what trusted connectivity, as my good friend mentioned. Connectivity, we are referring now from European terms as the full spectrum of digital and physical infrastructure. And the trust, the technologies that's going to meet this demand, both digital and physical, have to meet two assurances, a technical assurance and a political governance assurance, that individual rights, that due process to law, that all of those are fulfilled. So in that concept, I would be great to hear your perspective on it, sir. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and regards from Finland. Well, first of all, of course, being a Minister of Trade and Development, it's very unique, as you said. I know that in Europe we have countries like Netherlands, and I know that Australia has a similar arrangement. But I think it's very good, and it was great that Finland really envisaged this kind of elements from aid to trade years ago. And I really see that it's been a great opportunity to really pursue the development cooperation towards sustainable trade, and we can really deal with the sustainable development and sustainable development goals, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's the European Union or our bilateral cooperation, and especially public-private partnerships. And one of my main topics here in Washington today and tomorrow is that how we make the leverage. And then, of course, we come to the question of connectivity, trusted connectivity. And of course, for Finland, for European Union, it's so important that in this world, which is not that value-based, to be honest, it's very interest-based. And therefore, of course, the rules-based system, we really have to work on the multilateral commitments. And we need the multilateral world more than ever, I would say. And therefore, of course, the question of trust when it comes to connectivity, as you said yourself, first we have to define what we really mean by connectivity and trusted connectivity. And for Finland, of course, we want to lead by example. If you look at our legislation, our regulation, the things what we work with the European Union, the EU toolbox, we want to build up trust because we know from our history that if you build up trust, you get investments, you get development, you get people on board, you get companies on board. And therefore, of course, our 5G law, for instance, which really states that we are vendor neutral. So we let the best technologies to win, and we believe in market economy and openness and open trade. So therefore, it's been important that we really emphasize the trustworthiness. And since the Nordics, we do have say the two leading companies when it comes to telecom sector, we really want to pave the way for the rest of the world and really show that how important it is that we have the level playing field. But then, of course, the financing is the key, that how we really make the leverage and how we build up the services when it comes to connectivity for people. But also, when talking about 5G, then it's about businesses and the critical components within the network, business to enterprise solutions. Then we talk about the energy sector, we talk about oil and gas, but also the very core infrastructure and also the national security. And therefore, it's been very good to have a dialogue here with my US colleagues, but also at the global level. We really emphasize now the importance of the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, which is something that we work closely with the European Commission, work closely with our friends and allies here in the US. And this is time now to really build the content for the council, for the entity, and technology is one of the key components and the trustworthiness. And therefore, I really appreciate that I have the opportunity to be here today, so thank you for that.
No, thanks again, and I think after the opening comments, I'm going to come back and ask you for specificity, both on where you think US, Finland can work in regions. You just came from Ethiopia. And then really the shape and the scope that you anticipate for the TTC, Technology and Trusted, and so Trade and Technology Council as we go forward. Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness, you couldn't have a better person for, I think, with that title at the NSC and the NEC. And I think it'll become evident after the 4 years, but I would love to say this now, that you're really one of the great leaders that are working on behind the scenes today for Build Back Better, for the idea of how democracies can come together and meet the global infrastructure demand. So a personal vote of thank you to you, Pete, for doing all the great work. But I'd like to hear from you as to your anticipation. Great announcement at the G7 of Build Back Better. I think a participation of Secretary Raimondo at the Tallinn Digital Summit to talk about trusted connectivity and the Tallinn consensus on trusted connectivity. As going forward, and you mentioned multilateralism, you've been the key partner on doing both on the economic statecraft and others are working with the allies. What are the visions and what we can anticipate from the administration going forward on these issues? And then if you have anything specific talking with our Finland colleagues, please. So over to you, Pete.
No, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. And Kaush, it's a real pleasure to talk with you. And Minister, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'll make just a couple of minutes of comments on how we as the Biden-Harris administration are tackling the issue of trusted connectivity, first and foremost in the digital sector, which I think on this side of the Atlantic where a lot of the focus is when we talk about trusted connectivity. I know in Europe it's sort of a broader than just digital sector, and I think that's very appropriate, but here I think we often start with digital. And I'd highlight a couple of things here. First, as you alluded to, in June, coming out of the G7 summit, President Biden announced the Build Back Better World initiative, which is really coming from his understanding and belief, shared by other members of the G7 and other like-minded countries in Europe and in Asia, that in this era of geopolitical competition with China, we need to be more forward-leaning on what we can offer as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. We have to provide, these developing countries have huge infrastructure needs, as you highlighted, in both physical and digital infrastructure. And if we want them to build out using trusted providers and an ecosystem that we are all going to feel comfortable, and more importantly, their citizens are going to feel comfortable using, we have to step up to, increasingly provide some of the financing for that. We have to compete on the product suite. We have to compete in the standard-setting bodies. And so the Build Back Better World initiative is really where President Biden wants to take the U.S. and offering a more effective, a more efficient, a larger development financing role, starting with digital connectivity, but also including clean energy and also including healthcare. And I think you're going to see us implement that through the Development Finance Corporation, through some kind of streamlined and expanded EXIM-related programs, as well as some other tools that we're looking at with USAID and elsewhere to really create kind of an integrated suite of tools to really help foster those investments in trusted connectivity, not only in digital, but starting in digital and then expanding out to a couple of other sectors.
Well, thanks again, Pete, and rich area to come back to you on it. First of all, again, let's Vice President Susan Lund. I think, Dr. Lund, congratulations on your appointment. I think a very rich and varied experience from Peace Corps to Fulbright scholars to you've seen to McKinsey to IFC, so you've seen all spectrum of what we are talking about, what the infrastructure demand is and how best to meet it. President Biden, G7, said there might be about $40 trillion gap for global infrastructure connectivity initiatives. Now, no one country, no one public fund can meet it. Without mobilizing private sector, we cannot meet it. And agencies like yourself are the key players in making sure that that bridging happen. So it'd be really great to hear from you as the Vice President for Economics and for Private Sector at IFC, what the IFC and such position multilateral institutions can play in bridging this divide. And then I'll come back to you after that or now, and what role you think trusted connectivity framework plays in it. Over to you.
Well, first, let me say thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today and with my other panelists. I want to particularly mention the important role that Finland has played with the IFC. FinFund and the IFC have developed a climate initiative together, and next month in Glasgow, they're going to announce the UN Global Climate Impact Awards and a jointly funded project in the West Bank to put solar panels on schools so that children have electricity during the day is one of the winners that's going to be announced. So that's an example of what we can do. I think that in the opening remarks, we heard about the gap. So there are different estimates, but let's say we need $1 trillion a year in infrastructure funding. Collectively, the development finance institutions, or DFIs, provide $161 billion. So you need almost a 5-to-1 leverage ratio. What we do at the International Finance Corporation, it's part of the World Bank Group, we invest in private sector companies in low-income and lower middle-income countries across a range of sectors, including infrastructure and digital. But we do it in a way that leverages private sector. So our goal is to open up markets and investments for the private sector. In the lowest income countries that are eligible for IDA funding or grant funding, and in fragile and conflict nations, For every dollar that the IFC invests, we bring $5 of private sector financing along with it. For particular projects like climate and gender related in a broader set of developing countries, the leverage ratios are even higher. So this is what I think we all are aiming for, and this is a way to open the doors. Now, it's very complicated, and the work that the World Bank Group does jointly, a lot has to go into enabling private sector investment to go where it's not going today. Often it's policy reforms, it's building up a regulatory capacity, it's sometimes de-risking projects. So it's complicated, it's time consuming, but in the end, it pays off. And over time, what we want to see is that countries are developing markets and attracting private capital themselves. So when we talk about connectivity and then trusted connectivity, I think that the private sector will be absolutely essential, but governments have an important role to play in setting the groundwork and the regulatory frameworks. When we come to trusted connectivity, right now, I don't have to tell anyone in this room that public trust in pretty much every country is very low, whether it's trust in government, trust in businesses, trust in the banking system, trust in multilateral institutions. Edelman, I think, did a recent survey that measured this, and public trust is just very low across the board. And there are different ways, I think, to building back trust. One is going to be, I think, to show results. So President Malpass at the World Bank Group, you may have heard him talk about, we want a recovery that's green, resilient, inclusive development. Too many people were left behind for the last 20 years. So even while the rich got richer, many people in the countries that we serve really didn't see the impact. And we can't wait another 20 years for this to trickle down, especially in an age of digital connectivity where global inequality is more glaring and evident when somebody in Mali can see what life is like elsewhere. So I think one way to build back trust is to start to show results, focus on direct measures, whether it's education, health, vaccines, enabling digital finance for the everyday person, to start improving their lives. Now, there's much more around transparency in government, and we can talk about different things, different ways that digital can help build trust, but I would say a core focus that we all need to have is delivering results to people at the bottom of the pyramid.
Thanks again. So I think I will leave the slogans aside, because every time we come around, whether it's green, inclusive, but I'll key up on the other issue that you mentioned, that we need to show results. So let's focus the rest of this discussion on how best we can get at it. There's almost a sort of undeniable fact, which is that we need to work together. Whether you call it multilateralism, re-strengthening of the alliances, reforming of the whatever the term would be, what we basically need to work together. That we need to do at least at two levels. One, to come up with a framework that allows democracies to work together, whether it be trusted connectivity or other. And then specifically actions that say, here's how we're working together. So I want to ask you now, from Finland's perspective, where do you think in Finland is moving on those two fronts? On the framework side of stuff, I know we talked about trusted connectivity. I know that the Commission President van der Leyen has talked about global gateway. We've had from Charles Michel and others talk about trusted connectivity as a framework, Build Back Better as a framework. And then specifically, to do that, we'll have to have our DFCs work better than they are today. So let's focus on that, right? So you've got FinFund, you're working with IFC, talks about working that with DFC. Can other stuff work together specifically? I'd like to have your specific thoughts, and then I'm going to ask Pete to sort of respond to it. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And well, I think to your question that how we see it in Finland or Europe is that yes, I think the frame is there, and the structures are there. It's more now the time to act and deliver and execute. So in Europe, we have reshaped our development financing architecture with EIB, with EBRD, and now it's really time to deliver. And this is a message from the European Union, from my colleague, the Finnish Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen, towards Africa, towards the developing world, that now it's time to deliver. And that's why we have gathered this Team Europe in place. So it's each and every EU 27 country with the foreign ministers, development ministers, but also we have to do better. We have to get rid of the silos and we have to implement. And then we come to the questions that how we do it, how we get the private sector on board, how we utilize the blended finance. And this is something that we have very good learnings and very good cases per countries. But now my message here today and tomorrow is that we really have to get things going and our, let's say, bilateral actions going. And that's why I'm meeting with EXIM, I'm meeting with DFC and other financing institutions, because as I said earlier, we really have to act now. But then we also have to look at the infrastructure, and the technology is not the only thing. If you don't have the education in place, if you don't have the system level approach, whether it comes to education, social and healthcare, and of course coming from the Nordic country, we've been working for those things for decades, since the Second World War. And also I want to thank WFP and David Beasley that he nominated me as a school meal ambassador, and I'm working with this global school meal system. We have 60 countries on board. I really want to thank the commitment from the US. We aim to increase the resources with 2 billion euros. Our aim is that 2030, every child, every boy and girl has a right, a human right to get school meal. And that's something we started in Finland in 1941 in the middle of the war. So we also delivered that to our ecosystem. But back to your question then about the trusted connectivity and the 5G networks and the implementation. It's something that we do have to understand the geopolitics, but we also have to understand the business models. And that's something that we shouldn't be that instrument-driven. We should be mission-driven. And that's the strength of Finland, that whether it's the energy cluster or the digital cluster, we have to be holistic and we have to come with a system-level solution. So that's what I emphasize to my people, to my government, to my European colleagues, that instead of doing single projects, we have to have a system-level approach at the country level. And that's why Finland established this business-to-government unit to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that we can really gather the network of companies, NGOs, and the key people to the forefront to really implement. And that's something we really want to work with the US and with our like-minded friends throughout the world.
Now, Minister Skinnari, you're a man from the field, you're a recreational fisherman, you're a good hockey player, so let me say, your answer, I think, if you were from the Washington, D.C. crowd, sounds great, because of all the bells and whistles, systems, we need to work together. But if there was a fellow sitting in Ghana or Mali looking at it, I don't know what he'd get out of our discussion as to how that helps or makes the life better. So another point on the regulatory environment, we're all development people here, we all understand it's absolutely important. Let's stipulate it. I think if I was to ask most African colleagues or friends what they need from us, do you think they will say more regulatory assistance, or would they say, am I getting some money from you, which I get from China, to build a road? So how do we address that, and how do we address it individually and collectively, I think? And I would posit this, I'll let you think about it till I come back to it, but that's where we need to be. Like, I think, again, back to Pete's point and his leadership and President Biden's, the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation of the United States, made a pretty amazing and I think extraordinary jump from OPEC to DFC. And I'm going to ask now that all our European colleagues are to match it. And the jump was this, among other things, whether the cap number and equity and debt, those are not the issue. But the need for a DFC investment anywhere where American nexus was a requirement has become a strong preference. So DFC can fund a Finnish company in Africa without an American company in this setup. And it'd be good to know where Finland or EBRD or EIB will get to it, because that's where we'll need to get to at truly working on DFC collaboration, whether you call it complementary investments or whatever. I'll let you think about it till I come back to it. Pete, over to you. Again, I think a little bit of a shot, and we should spend a lot of time on the Trade and Technology Council. At the end of the day, when you talk about working together, the two big heavyweights on the economic fronts is EU and US. And the TTC and how it can come together on this front, be great to hear from you.
Yeah, no, actually, before I get to the TTC, which, as you say, is the two big heavyweights, I do also want to highlight some of the work from this administration's perspective that we're doing with the Asian Quad, Australia, Japan, and India, where at the Leaders Summit just, I guess, 3 weeks ago, there were announcements coming out of all 4 countries to support new funding for digital infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region. And we sort of are seeing that as, what I think you would characterize as kind of parallel investments, or sometimes co-investments. So you can get in these kind of legally tied knots where you're literally looking at 2 different DFIs co-investing together, pooling funds. But certainly parallel investments is something that seems practical and tangible, and we've gotten our
parallel or sequential.
Yeah, sort of one person can fund this tranche of it, and next can fund this tranche and that. And so we're doing that in Asia, and we're also doing it in Europe. I mean, as the minister said, he's meeting with the DFC and or did today. I wasn't sure on the timing. And so we're having, similar conversations in Europe, both through the TTC, which is with the European Union, and also bilaterally with key member states. So I think it really is, the work we're seeing kicking off with the TTC a couple of weeks ago, but really getting carried forward and sort of, every couple of weeks or more often meetings where we're really pulling together some of the key DFIs, getting them to look at specific projects. It's not glamorous work doing that, right? And it's often more at the technical level, but that's really what you need to drive forward with these investments. I do want to make one point, though, which is I think when we think about what we as the West can do, particularly in emerging markets, a country, whether it's Kenya or Ghana or whatever. I mean, the financing is definitely a piece of it. But I also think there's a piece of it that is simply, helping to broker the deal, helping to open some doors for the companies, right? The financing is a key piece of it. But actually, telecoms, there is in a number of countries private commercial capital available. There's plenty of money out there in certain countries. And so I think another important piece of it really is kind of the old-fashioned sort of explaining, why, whether it's a Nokia or whether it's a U.S. kind of ORAN startup, why that is going to be a more valuable and trusted player that, is going to serve citizens better, that is going to provide privacy and security, and that, at the end of the day, actually will probably come in cheaper over the long run, because of lower power consumption and, better life cycle costs. So I think that's actually another really important piece of it beyond just the sort of financing angle of it.
But not just to build on it, even before the deal, just providing a platform where the government entities and the business entities can at least come and meet and know what the options are. Even that is missing, particularly on the digital side. So you got a lot of industry people who are looking to invest, don't know who the right people to talk to, and the vice versa. So I think a lot of good roles can be played there. So let's hear from you what IFC can play in this particular case. And then another question I'll ask you, which is a little bit more complicated and I think difficult, but to say that we have done most of these investments, especially from World Bank and IFC, in a more of a sort of a positive, not a normative sense, and which is to say, we're just doing development, irrespective of where the money is coming from, or even to some degree, I'm being a little bit free here. I'm pointing to state-owned enterprises, their role when you are either taking money or implementing issues, and for some directed relations to, so whether the relevant effort is actually contributing to monopolies and monopsonies, or it's actually, that's the thing that To be quite honest with you, talking to World Bank colleagues and others, the question was, haven't made a call on it yet. But that's a bigger question. But first, I'd like to ask you, where do you see the specific where DFCs, with IFC and others, can come together? And in the framework side, you're not a political entity, but what may be helpful as we go forward?
Well, let me start by saying I do agree that the money is only a piece of it. And so in the new strategy of the IFC and the World Bank, we're looking at what we call going upstream. The fact is there aren't a lot of great bankable projects sitting around Africa that we could just go fund. So it's really moving upstream to look at where there are market gaps, what needs to change to enable an investment to happen, how would a multilateral like the World Bank go in, what kind of de-risking do we need to enable private capital to go in. So it's really working with governments much more closely upstream to then create the conditions where a private sector investment can be made. So that is often just getting the parties to meet, as you pointed out. Sometimes it's offering technical assistance to the government where their civil service doesn't necessarily know how to create the right regulations, especially we're talking about digital. So I think that that's a hugely important piece of it, and it's a shift that that our organization has made to focus on moving further upstream to create those investments downstream. The second thing I'd say is, you asked the question, what would somebody watching from Mali get out of this conversation? I think that we have a wealth of experience now on what works, right? So I'll take the example of mobile money, digital money, person-to-person payments, right? Kenya started this 10, 15 years ago with M-Pesa. It was a way for men who were working in the city to more safely send home cash to their families in the countryside. And it went wild. And this became a dominant player. Now we're starting to see it in West Africa. So there's a company, Wave, started in Senegal, started with remittances. The fees were a third of what the large-scale telecom player was asking, and so their market share has shot to roughly half. Now they're expanding across French West Africa. So on some level, we know what works, so now we need to get to it. Let's replicate the experiments that we know work around the world. In terms of, do we support monopolists? No, we don't. We're all about creating competitive markets. And actually on the state-owned enterprise front, there are very clear guidelines about investments in state-owned or partially state-owned, and how much ownership has to be non-state-owned before we can touch it, and all sorts of rules and regulations. And I think, this is where I'm going to come back to digital. Digital, this example of Wave in West Africa, of completely disrupting a very entrenched telecom market, is a really good one. And I think it's the power of what we could see. There's so many other examples. For instance, I'll go back to Kenya. During the pandemic, a platform that directly connects something like 15,000 Kenyan farmers to tens of thousands of vendors in the marketplace. And so through this app, they can do orders directly. So the farmers can actually see what the prices are. They can plant what's in high demand. Vendors get a more assured supply. So I think that these digital platforms, we think of it in many advanced economies as, what you get to at the end of the development path. But I think that mobile internet connectivity is going to enable a lot of leapfrog opportunities in emerging markets where, instead of building out landline telecom, they jump directly to mobile. I think that what you're seeing, these very simple apps, don't even need a smartphone to work them, to transform connecting producers to consumers, connecting businesses to each other, people to each other with money, really has the potential to be transformative. In the next, I think, 2 years, you're going to see the submarine cable, internet cable going down the west coast of Africa is going to be finished with landing stations along the coast. East coast of Africa, I think a little bit longer time frame, but I think in the next few years, we're going to see this absolutely transformative impact of digital, or at least the potential, if we can leverage the finance, give the technical assistance, and get with it.
So let me build off on that. I mean, I just think there's a lot of this discussion on trusted connectivity, I think unhelpfully, to be quite, is sort of countering China and what the replacement of China is more the affirmative part of what you just said. All these Bill Gates and others said we always sort of overestimate next 5 years and underestimate next 10 years what may change. And that's something that you're alluding to. So there are a lot of people, like Dr. Lund, and I'm one of them, who think that the whole idea of Africa has not been appropriately addressed. There's always discussion on how poor it is, how lack of infrastructure and this, as opposed to a fastest growing continent, youngest population, because of not having all this infrastructure, absolutely a fantastic fertile petri dish for all kind of digital changeover happening at a very fast pace. So with that in mind, that sort of this whole aspect of a digital revolution of 4G to 5G not being an evolutionary but a revolutionary point of view, the IoT that will come through at SpaceX, Wi-Fi 6, all that stuff will make connectivity. What's the Finland version? I mean, you're sitting on top of, you've got Nokia on your side. You have a tendency to use the term we are neutral, but you also have Alcatel now, submarine cable, so that you're a big player in it. So what's the affirmative vision from Finland's side, both on trade and development, on not only, you're basically trying to meet a future that hasn't even been fully defined, but we think it's there and we should shoot for it, which is the digital revolution of sorts in Africa and other places. And how can we work together on it? And it's important because inherently all this is going to be data and privacy. We'll get into privacy and we'll get into authoritarianism. But first we got to articulate the affirmative vision for it.
Well, you asked that what is Finland's approach to Africa? Is there a difference compared to the past and the history? Well, of course, normally here I'm talking about, and I'm asked about the Arctic region and Russia, and maybe that's a topic for the next panel. But we composed our first ever Africa strategy in Finland. And what we wanted to underline is that we want to create true partnerships. And I will give you 2 examples. For instance, with Kenya, with Nairobi, we are bringing not just our startup people and the world's biggest startup event Slush to Nairobi right after the pandemic allows, but we also bring the private investors, the venture capitalist companies from Finland and Europe. So in other words, we are building the trust at the local level. It's a mutual trust. And of course, we want to get the commitment from the local people plus the local investors. And secondly, of course, we really want to work with our key assets like forest expertise, digital connectivity, but also in the field of education. Because without the education, as the example of Finland shows for decades, you cannot be competitive in the long run. In your employment, in your sustainable growth, education is the key. And that's why we really want to work on every girl and boy to have access to school in place. Then your question towards the future and the current situation, I really believe that once we implement what we have now in place, of course we are doing huge investments, public and private, back home in Finland to research and development and innovations, not just for 5G but also for 6G. And of course here in Washington and here in the US, I'm very happy to say that Nokia is, let's say, the most American telecom company when it comes to their national commitment here, as far as the jobs, as far as R&D, as far as the investments, and as far as the ability to work at the global level together. But the core and the heart is in Finland, and it will be in Finland, because our education system allows that we get the top engineers, but we also need true partnerships with the Americans here in order to really flourish in Africa, in Latin America, and then we come to the finance and the development finance. And that's I'm so happy to listen to you, IFC for instance, and World Bank, and DFC and Exim, that we have a, let's say, we have a mutual political will to deliver. And I really look forward that we can go to the practical things, because maybe that's a good thing of ourselves Finns, that we are very practical. We do things, we deliver. And that's why, of course, we are very result orientated. But we need the future investments, as you said. But now it's all there. The technology is there. We can do things. And therefore, it's so important that we act now.
No, I think, yes, I'm fully sort of proud that Nokia is an American company, and very happy to know that the core will stay in Finland so we can benefit from your great education system. And every Russian I ever met always said you're very practical people. So it's good to know that Finland. Let me ask you, Pete, I think this is an issue here, building off something Susan said. We've got a lot of concern and funding going now on the green economy side. We have a lot of that going on the digital side of stuff, and of course all on this as a trusted connectivity rubric. But what are the thinking from the administration side to sort of, again, same question I asked the minister, the vision for Africa and really this digital revolution that's going to happen? I think that's why we were all engaged in whether Huawei or not. But that Huawei debate is behind us. I think technology, even short term, has moved on with everything else. And so it'd be great to hear from you as to how the three main things on President Biden and your issues, whether it be green economy and building back better, whether it be the digital side, and also making sure that the democracy has a better response to this than the authoritarian alternative.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and a really important question. I should begin by saying, I think, from a Biden administration perspective, we think there's a huge amount of opportunity in Africa. I mean, you brought up M-Pesa and sort of the way in which they revolutionized digital, finance, first in East Africa and now taking it across the continent, and, competitors and imitators around the world, and that was happening 15 years ago. I mean, you look today at what's happening in Nigeria with fintech startups. I mean, you see entrepreneurialism in the tech sector across Africa, and I think there's a ton of opportunity there. And we are certainly hearing and seeing more and more interest from our private sector, whether it is folks involved in manufacturing, light manufacturing, looking to diversify their supply chains. As you say, demographically, there's a ton of opportunity in Africa. We're seeing more and more interest there. Obviously, in the tech sector, as we are sort of thinking about some of the more traditional resources in Africa, and again, thinking about diversifying supply chains. I think you're seeing a lot of mining interest, but in a much more sustainable way than it was traditionally done. So I think there's a ton of opportunity for sustainable investments in a range of industries in Africa. And as you alluded to, I mean, often it's sort of seen as one continent. It's not one continent. It has, 15 or 20 countries that are among the fastest growing in the world. I mean, there's a ton of opportunity. There. And what does it need in order to prosper? Well, you need power, right? I mean, for any of this digital stuff to work, you need power, you need connectivity, you need the digital connectivity, you need telecommunications networks, and then you need physical infrastructure. And especially for export-led growth, you need ports, you need roads, and other infrastructure. And so, I think you're seeing us both at a government level with some of the financing initiatives move out on that, but then also encouraging, our companies to make investments. I mean, Google just 2-3 weeks ago announced a new $1 billion investment in various parts of telecommunications infrastructure in Africa. And I think you're going to see other American companies as well as European companies really look at the opportunity there for commercially driven investment that's kind of win-win for everybody. And we can come in with some of the technical expertise, some of the financing on the side. But I really think, I think that's very important. But again, I think across the kind of high growth economies in the continent, a big piece of it is door opening, and a big piece of it is getting our companies out there to lead front and center, knowing we'll have the financing window, some of the technical assistance, alongside to enable those investments.
I'm going to ask after I'm going to Dr. Lund, come back to you, Pete, to ask you how things work in the Quad world at a little bit faster pace, perhaps, than Europe, and what we can then learn on the Europe side, but I'll come back to it. Dr. Lund, taking the Africa example again, and I think back to a very important element that world is moving pretty fast, And in that fast digital side of stuff, what are the right models that we've historically used for private blended financing and whatever? Is the model fine as it is, or it can do some more updating just to be a little bit more nimble and a little bit more responsive to this new digital economy? And so I think this is a question that says, where is IFC on it? And is again a question to say, where is IFC and where you may think normatively other DFCs can be working with IFC to respond to this new challenge, new opportunity?
Look, being nimble and efficient is not a static goal. It requires continuous improvement for the best companies in the world, like Nokia, as well as the DFIs like the World Bank and IFC. So it is something that I think the organization continues to work on. And I think that I want to go back to something that Pete said about connectivity and starting to talk about American companies thinking about Africa. You know, I think that if we take a step back and think about where we are with global value chains and global trading systems, work that I did at the McKinsey Global Institute before joining the IFC looked at the supply chains in various industries. And these were mainly created 10, 15 years ago. Companies, a typical multinational company like Nokia has probably 5 or 6,000 tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. If you go to the third tier of their supply chain, you're talking about over 10,000. And these things grew up gradually over time. At a time when labor costs were different, energy costs were different, transportation costs were different. And the COVID shock has really caused a lot of companies to sit back, and suddenly CEOs are talking about supply chain. And having worked with private sector companies, like let me tell you, the board and the CEO never talked about supply chains. Like this is deep in operations. This is like in the weeds purchasing, right? And suddenly it's a CEO issue because a lot of companies are saying, you know, we have a supply chain in place that's not resilient. It's not even necessarily optimized for the world we live in terms of cost. So how do we diversify? And I think there's a ton of opportunity, and we're seeing it already in Africa, in Turkey, in the Middle East, serving the European market, Central America, Latin America, serving the US market. And this is not to say, you know, all the investment in Asia is still there, but like we're seeing, for instance, Samsung, some Japanese companies show interest in moving some advanced electronic production to India. So I think that we are, in that way too, at a place where there's going to be a lot more, let's say, money up for grabs or a lot happening in terms of trying to link the countries that didn't really participate heavily in the global trading system, really getting them connected, because that's another form of connectivity and another way of building economic relationships that ultimately can lead to, you know, political relationships and more stability in the world. So I think it would be a very positive development if we can go back to the trade component of this and see more countries more heavily engaged, trading with their neighbors and with regional trade, and then trading, you know, across continents as well.
No, thanks again. Pete, let me come to you. I think we've got about 10, 12 minutes. So I think we've had a lot of sort of preliminary discussion. Time is short, especially for people who occupy your positions. Being there, you think you got 4 years, but that moves so quickly, and there's so much to do. And particularly a lot of what I do is to really bring like-minded allies, partners together with a framework and with a much more complementary and coordinated effort. It's a huge call, big deal. God bless you for doing all the work that you are doing. Towards that end, I think some concluding thoughts would come back to you, but I want then Minister to respond to this. In some ways, there's some urgency to this, which is, you know, experienced differently by different folks. Those who are, let me say, step back and say, President Biden deserves a lot of kudos to discover and frame this issue, the most important question between whether democracy or autocracy offers the best way forward. That's not just on connectivity, it's on climate, it's on health, and all the matters that you talked about. To that end, sometimes this urgency is felt a lot more with the frontline democracies which are next to the authoritarian countries. So whether that be the Quad countries, far more responsive and active, or whether it be the 3 Cs countries on the edge. Those who are a little removed have the luxury to sort of think and talk about at a more comfortable pace. So as we move forward, I think it'd be good to hear from your perspective all the good work that is being done on the Quad and on the Europe. What can we learn? What are some of the priorities? What are some of the things we really need to get going, both at institutional coordination and framework?
Kaush, first, I want to say I appreciate you bringing up President Biden's comments, which he makes frequently, both publicly and privately, about seeing kind of one of the great challenges of our time, this contest between autocracy and democracy. Because I think he means it sort of very sincerely and very passionately, that, we are, just like if you look at Freedom House statistics or other statistics out there, there's been a democratic recession over the last decade. It's sort of undeniable. And that's something that sort of 15 or 20 years ago, I think most of us coming out of the end of the Cold War would have thought would be impossible, right? You see this as a one-way direction, one-way street towards kind of greater freedom and greater democracy. In the last several years, really 10 years, have sort of shown that's not the case. And so it's very passionate. He's very passionate about this concept. And as you say, for him, the core way in which you're going to get kind of the re-energization of democracies around the world and a path back to seeing democracy spread is by showing that democracies can deliver for their people. Because most people, they want the lights to come on, they want security at home, they want education for their kids. They want to do better than they did in their youth, and they want their kids to do better than them. And so, and I think people are looking at this. If an authoritarian state delivers all of that, and democratic states don't seem to be delivering, I think that's not the world we want to live in. And so it's very, very personal for him, and he's quite passionate about it. Goes on about it, trying to galvanize both governments and companies. I've heard him talk about this with CEOs to galvanize, companies to do this as well as governments. And I think for us then, whether we look at the Quad or whether we look at the TTC, it really boils down to how can we, develop and announce and implement investments and policy changes that really do make practical changes in people's lives. The era of, at least for the next couple of years for the U.S., I think we should be candid, the era of sort of great big new trade deals, probably, that's not something we're doing in the next couple of years. So when you look at Asia, it's kind of, okay, well, but, can we get our DFIs together to announce, new deals in Southeast Asia, in places like PNG and India? Can we get our companies actually investing in these places? And so you've seen us, leadership makes kind of political commitments, but then driving through our agencies, how do we align the financing, corporate outreach to actually make that happen? I think with the TTC, look, I think that the TTC with Europe is new, just up and launched as of a couple of weeks ago. I think there is a lot of potential there. I think there's a tremendous amount of will on both sides. I think the Europeans are looking at how can they bring some of the member states in as well. Right now, it's obviously at the union level, but the member states have a lot of the expertise, a lot of the money, a lot of the equities. They're looking at how they can bring that in, and I think we see just tremendous opportunity there on, whether it's semiconductor supply chain cooperation, whether it is secure telecommunications, whether it is sort of taking on non-market trade challenges. I think that 6, 12 months from now, you're going to see us move out with a set of announcements across these different working groups. And that's how we'd like to be judged. Have we actually gotten the specific announcements out?
Yeah, practical would be good. How does it look from your side?
Well, first of all, I think when it comes to climate policies and the upcoming COP26, of course, we are very proud in Finland and Europe that most of the world is committed to be carbon neutral. In Finland, it's 2035, and it's a challenge. Even for us, it's a lot of work. But we have the commitment, we have even the financing in place pretty much. But the question is that with what kind of vehicles we do the execution. And I think this is the Green Deal approach for Europe. but also for the world. And I think same goes to digitalization, that what are the vehicles that how we really thrive together and get people's acceptance at the local level. The reason I mention local level and the municipalities, the cities, is that at least in Finland we've learned that, okay, we wanted to get rid of coal, and we have done it at the local level, and we've done it together with the private sector. In other words, we get people on board. And it's the same with the digitalization. And those are the learnings from Finland. I really believe that this is also the way for the world, and I'm very proud and I really appreciate President Biden's commitment for the infrastructure package. And as a new thing for Finland, as a minister, we start to do things also at the regional level and state level. So tomorrow I will continue to Minnesota, which is almost like back home in Finland. But honestly, so we have to be practical, and we have, well, as a politician, as a minister, of course, we have to get the results in place. And as you said, 4 years is nothing. We have actually 2 years left in Finland, not even that. So we really have to deliver before the elections. And of course, we have to be sustainable when it comes to economics, environment, but also as far as people's acceptance that, hey, we can really afford for these changes. And that's why, of course, it's a matter of politics and matter of political will. And I'm very proud that Finland has been able to, for instance, even to carry the global responsibility when it comes to development aid at the same time. And we really wanted to highlight the importance of United Nations at the same time. Because, for instance, when we look at the pandemic, we see in Finland, even in Europe, that we really have to work on the resilience, as you said. And that's something that we really have to work together. But once again, for us, for Finland, there is so much we can do between Europe and the US. And that's why, as you mentioned, the TTC, I would rather say Technology and Trade Council. And I met the Madam Secretary today, and we really agreed that we start to act together, and Finland will take a strong voice when it comes to level playing field, when it comes to technology, and really to pave the way for this R&D and innovations, because that is the key, but that we are really investing into innovations and R&D, because at the end of the day, it's not just the infrastructure, it's the services on top of that. And that's where the business is, and that's where the results are as far as young people, as far as future jobs as well.
Susan, any concluding thoughts on what may be the practical ways of how countries like Finland and US and others may work together with IFC going forward?
Well, let me say first, the need has never been more urgent. So the pandemic put another 100 million people back into extreme poverty. So we're at a place right now where we've actually erased years of progress. So the need for development institutions and bilateral donors, Finland, the United States, DFC, other partnerships to come together with multilaterals like the World Bank Group, like the IFC, or the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, has just never been greater. And it's only with, I think, really coordinating efforts, as we've talked about, and going after the big ticket opportunities. I think digital connectivity is undeniably one of them. But the minister brought up climate. Everything now has got to be built in a way that's going to be climate resilient, or contribute to actually meeting the Paris Accord goals. So the World Bank Group is going to be doing climate diagnostic reports for individual countries over the coming year. And this is something we've promised to the board about how are even low-income countries going to align with the Paris Accord goals? How are they going to get there? And everything we do has to be contributing towards that goal. So that's going to be another massive challenge, but also for an optimist, I'm sorry, I'm an optimist at heart, a way to build back better, build differently in the first place. Instead of, powering Africa, they've got amazing hydropower potential. We're funding things called scaling solar in many countries, Zambia, Senegal, now moving into Central Asia. So, and the West Bank project with solar panels on school rooftops. I mean, we have an opportunity to actually approach things in a fresh way, but we need to do it in a coordinated way, because I think we've all agreed the funding a project here and there in sort of a scattershot manner really hasn't gotten the development impact that we need.
No, well, again, thanks again for the whole panel. I think we've run out of our hour, but I'll go back to the main issue that President Biden so very well articulated, whether democracies can meet today's needs and whether they can meet it better than autocracy. And the most important need among most of them is about connectivity, which is both digital and physical infrastructure that makes their lives better. And how to do it, we'll have to sort of work together. Trusted connectivity is a useful utilitarian framework to allow democracies to work. It is for interoperability between democracies to meet connectivity demand in a better way. How best to do it? It's a tough call. And that's why we have these panels, and we'll continue to have it to discuss how can we go back, whether your DFC and our DFCs can work better. What's the project? What are the lessons, like Pete says, that worked well into our submarine cable project? How did that work? How can we scale that up through the Quad, through the Indo-Pacific? And that's an ongoing discussion, and we'll continue to have it. I hope you continue to join us, and I hope we can provide a modest sort of catalyst role in trying to meet those 2-year, 4-year political cycle that we can achieve the necessary achievements. So thanks once more, and thanks to everybody who's here. And with that, I think we'll give an applause to our folks that came at the end of a busy day for busy people to come and talk about these things. Thank you again.